talk to you about bad government tonight. Government that changes the law to advance its private goals without public input. Okay, you might know something about it. There's a whole bunch of legislation that has been tinkered with as examples of this. Recently, we know about a lot of them in Bill C-38. I'm going to just mention a couple because there are some details in these two that I think people should generally know. Number one is the Species at Risk Act. Now, the amendments to the Species at Risk Act have been challenged by 13 prestigious, hardworking, dedicated Canadian environmental organizations recently. In 2006, they included Nature Canada, the Sierra Club, the Suzuki Foundation, and Forest Ethics. They signed a submission that complained to the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation that the Species at Risk Act, SARA, was failing to enforce the listing process for endangered species and was failing to enforce recovery planning and emergency order provisions to save those species. It made this case for 197 species, many of whom currently reside within the planned Gateway Pipeline Corridor. You should have a look at the Nature Canada's website. It's really a good resource for this information. Facts supporting the above complaints arose from the recent Cohen inquiry and records dated September 2011, which I read over carefully. At that time, former DFO Minister Davis commented on the plight of Cultus Lake sockeye, harvested successfully for centuries by the Suwali First Nations, and for many years a major contribution to the Fraser Valley commercial fishery. Spawning populations averaged 20,000 between 1920 and 1960, but plummeted to 93 fish, 93, in the year 2000. The Suwali urged the DFO to save the fish by restoring their habitat, depreciated and encroached on by development. DFO did the right thing initially. It asked itself, should the species be preserved? And it answered, yes, it should be. So it did another right thing. It asked the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada to investigate using science. Mr. Davis informed Cohen that the committee did this and recommended Cultus Lake sockeye be saved. It then listed these fish, unique in the world, as endangered. SARA stipulates that listing a species as endangered compels the minister responsible to order immediate remedial action, habitat restoration. No habitat, no habitat at Cultus Lake assured that these fish would die. So, and Davis said, quote, "You may not kill, according to SARA, harass or destroy the habitat of a listed species," unquote. I wanted to title this little story, The Pipe and the Piper. The Piper, codenamed Stephen, didn't like this. And he actually got these guys together and said, what are we going to do about this one? And what he did was this. He got the DFO to ask Environment Canada, that's the minister responsible for SARA, not to list Cultus Lake sockeye. That's simple. And after that, our government rewrote SARA, rewrote the act, to prevent further unpleasant incidents over endangered species. New wording now ensures that SARA, before listing any species as endangered, must consider and balance quote-unquote economic factors. 93 Cultus Lake sockeye, even though they're unique in the world, just aren't worth a lot to the economy. And more in that category will follow their fate. Goodbye, chums. The Fisheries Act. Let's look at the Fisheries Act and its amendments. There were many, and they clearly ticked off Justice Cohen, who didn't become aware of them all game changers to his inquiry, until he had heard all testimony and was about to write his report. Said Cohen, quote, "It is regrettable that the legislative amendments, especially those relating to the Fish Act, could not have waited until the government of Canada had the opportunity to consider this report. Because," quote, "neither the Commission Counsel or counsel for the participants had the opportunity to explore the potential impact of these changes on DFO's management and habitat protection programs and activities." I was one of those participants, by the way. There are 810. As it is, Canadians may never get that opportunity because of amendments made to the Act. Here's a few. Section 35(1), that's the most commonly known one. It says, "No person shall carry on work or undertaking that results in harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat," similar to Sarah. Now, conditions, imprecise wording that will have to be defined in court, and qualifiers disable the protection process of Section 35 and make it completely meaningless. From here on, it must be proven that work done in fish habitat, say running a tractor into a stream and digging an irrigation channel, actually cause quote unquote serious harm. That's the new terminology. It hasn't been defined. Our government wants you and me to help them define that and put it in their new regulations. But don't worry at all if the fish impacted aren't of quote unquote economic value. They don't count, and neither does their habitat. Before this amendment, no one could get away with a HAD if DFO did its job. Now HADs can occur, hazardous disruption, disturbance of, Now they can get away with that. Anybody can get away with that, especially since they're now, it can be at the discretion of the minister whether something like this is actually happening, or whether it should be allowed, or regulations made by the cabinet. They can also allow it. They're supposedly making those up as we speak. Section 35(3). This amendment makes exceptions to the serious harm definition and restraint. Certain prescribed conditions now, for example, allow HADs. Section 36 kept the lid on deleterious substances entering the habitat. That was the responsibility mainly of Environment Canada. We didn't really want to do it and often bounced it back to DFO. We didn't want to do it and bounced it back to them, sort of like a hot potato. Now the minister, but it was there. Now the minister may allow, quote unquote, exceptions after considering the following. 1, the contribution of the relevant fish, for example, Cultus Lake sockeye, of commercial, recreational, of aboriginal value. Note, every year in April, thousands of teachers and kids release fry they've nurtured and raised in classroom aquariums into streams, many of which don't have much protection from deleterious substances or bulldozers from here on. Goodbye, chums. 2, fisheries management objectives must be weighed into this formula now. What are those, pray tell? I think they have something to do with the economic value of fish. 3, exceptions must be in the public interest. I'm not sure how the Piper will define that, public interest, but polls I read say 80% of BC folks are interested in saving wild salmon. That's what we're interested in. Number 4, Section 37 amendment. This directs the minister to end works that harmfully alter fish habitat or lead to deposits of deleterious substances. And now there are exceptions. Section 32, quote, prohibits the killing of fish by any means other than fishing. It seems redundant to me, but I'm wondering if it's intended to apply to situations where you suck all the fish out of a good lake that's been producing fish naturally for hundreds of years, like Fish Lake in the interior, and thereby kill them. Because they're not used to that, I guess. In order that the space they occupied might be used for mining tailings. Section 43, I'll end with this one, allows Cabinet to repeal Section 32 at any time. Now, I don't get this one at all. Maybe it means if the piper suddenly acquires an environmental conscience, he can reverse his hard stand on fish and habitat by repealing some of his stupid actions made in legislation. I'd like to see him have that option for all the amendments that they've made. So would Cohen, by the way. As I said, they made it harder for him to do his job. Amendments to the Environmental Assessment Act added to his job and his task. It cost us more money. You can look up his comments about it on www.cohencommission.ca. Well, to conclude, some of you, and I could go on to talk to you about other acts, the mining acts, the same wording almost, word by word. The way that it's been reworded to disable protection is in so many pieces of legislation, which was all done behind closed doors, in secret, with no debate in Parliament, no public discussion, no involvement of you and I, because our government thinks that in the best interests of ours at this time is for him to open the doors, open the gateway to oil and gas development. This, regardless of what happens to our resources and our environment. To conclude, okay, Robert Kennedy, before he was assassinated in 1968, he wrote a book entitled The Enemy Within. Anybody read that one? Okay, I've got a copy, I'll lend it to you. It showed how the rights of working people to run their lives, their unions, had been stolen, pulled out from under them, along with their pension money, by organized crime. My father used to tell me about the stories about this sort of thing when I was a kid. Organized crime and union crooks like Jimmy Hoffa. One good thing, he's buried somewhere now in cement. Kennedy's efforts inspired a backlash that eventually brought justice to American workers and restored faith in their democracy. Go Obama. If Kennedy were alive today, he'd have a sequel to his book. And there'd be chapters dealing with our current government and their Machiavellian plan to promote pipelines, promote the oil industry, but rob us of our voice and a natural environment that is envied by the entire world. That is life itself to many of the people here tonight. Thank you.
We're saying, as a society, urgently, we need to stop and think about the complex layers of this issue. The right of corporations to own natural resources and expropriate land to transport them through. The obligations and deep connections of our First Nations peoples to the land. The likelihood of leaks and tanker disasters. The competition between pipelines for corporate profits and the absurdity of exporting refining jobs.